Hey guys, you think you've got it rough when your heater breaks for a night? Maybe your kids didn't call this week. Maybe dinner was quiet, just you, the spoon, and a chair no one sat in. Let me paint you a different kind of cold. Not the kind you fix with a blanket, or the kind that wraps around your ribs, creeps into your joints, and doesn't leave when the fire's lit. The kind that takes someone every night. Because in 1350, winter wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a slow, quiet killer. No insulation, no thermostat, no one knocking to check if you're okay. Just a hut, a fire that might have died in the night. And if you're lucky, one other body still breathing beside you. So, before we begin, get comfortable, adjust your pillow, pull up your blanket, and if this kind of story helps you sleep, I'd love if you liked or subscribed. Drop a comment with where you're listening from, and maybe who you're missing tonight. Congratulations! You just woke up in a small village in northern England in the year 1350. There's no sunrise, just grey. No warmth, just dampness biting through the furs you slept under. Your fingers don't move right. Your breath forms clouds. And you reach for a fire that might already be gone. Your family, if they're still with you, are huddled together in silence. Not from love, from survival. Because here, in this forgotten corner of the little Ice Age fire isn't comfort. Fire is life. You wake to the smell of old smoke and damp wool. Not light, not warmth. The sky hasn't changed colour yet, just a heavy grey pressing in through the parchment-covered window, diffused and dull, like sleep that never quite lets go. The cold is the first thing you understand. It lives inside your bones. You haven't even moved, but it's already there. Your feet are numb. Your nose stings. And though you're covered in 3 layers of wool blankets and 2 stitched furs, the air under your chin is colder than a stone basin left outside. You hear it before you feel it, the soft rustle of straw, the scrape of a wooden ladle on the hearth floor. Someone is already moving. You don't know who. You hope it's your son, or your wife, or anyone who can coax a flame from last night's ashes. The fire died hours ago, and here in 1350 in this single-room house in northern England, that means you're on a clock now. There is no heater to kick in, no thermostat to adjust. There is only the ember, and whether it's still breathing. You stay still, still as a stone, because moving means giving up what little body heat you've managed to trap inside your blankets. The children are curled nearby, 3 of them sleeping in layers like the rings of an old tree. Your wife is at the far side, curled tight around the youngest. None of them speak. They don't need to. Everyone knows the first to rise has the hardest job. Laurent, your eldest boy, is 14, a man by the village's measure. You hear him kneel near the hearth. You hear the dry crunch of kindling being placed, not thrown each twig arranged like a surgeon preparing tools. No one wastes kindling. It takes too long to gather and too long to dry, and green wood smokes. Smoke makes babies cough. Then comes the sound you wait for, the soft click of flint against steel. Once, twice, a third, then a breath, a slow, deliberate exhale over what you pray is still a glowing coal. There's silence. Then, a cough of flame. You breathe for the first time in minutes. The boy did it. The fire is no bigger than a cupped hand, but it lives, and because it lives, so will you. You shift your weight and rise from the bed platform, careful not to wake the littlest one, Celia. Her breath is shallow, even, curled beneath her mother's shawl. Her feet are wrapped in scraps of rabbit skin. The ground is a frozen clay floor, packed hard and cold as iron. You pull on your stockings wool, mended twice, and step toward the hearth. Laurent is adding more twigs now, building a crosshatch to guide the flame upward. His cheeks are red from the cold, his lips cracked. He doesn't speak. You don't either. This part of the day is sacred, and you pick up a thicker branch seasoned-ish and hand it to him without a word. He places it with care. Behind you, your wife stirs. Isabel. She pulls the shawl tighter around her and joins you. Her movements are practiced, quiet. She adds a small piece of peat, saved from last month's delivery, to keep the burn steady. The 3 of you kneel around this tiny flame as if it were an altar, because in some way it is. Your family cannot afford to waste firewood. You have enough seasoned logs to last another 6 days if you ration carefully. After that, you may have to burn furniture. You've done it before. The stool near the door has only 2 legs now. Laurent checks the wood pile outside each evening, brushing off snow and covering the rest with a ragged hide. The damp seeps in regardless. Wet wood is worse than none at all. It chokes the chimney hole and fills the house with sour smoke. You glance toward the beams above. Smoke stains have blackened them into charcoal ribbons. There's no proper chimney here. The smoke rises and finds its own way out, curling through every crack in the thatched roof. It takes warmth with it, but not today. Today, the smoke stays low. The air is still. That's good. Still air means the fire will catch. Still air means maybe, just maybe, Celia won't cough through breakfast. The fire grows. A pot of thin oat porridge is set to warm. Your wife crushes dried nettles between her fingers, adds them for strength. Bread is too precious for every day. The family eats pottage, not loaves. And if it's warm, even thin pottage can feel like mercy. You pass out the morning meal without ceremony. Each person receives a half cup. Children first, then your wife, then you. Celia wakes just as the steam begins to curl from the pot. Her fingers are pink and stiff. She smiles when she sees the flame. You help her sit near it, wrapping another shawl around her back. She whispers, "Is it warmer today?" "Papa." You lie. You say, "Yes." The house is still dim, only the hearth casts light. A single beeswax candle remains in the chest. Saved for illness or prayer, you will not waste it. Laurent tends the fire as you eat. He is learning. You no longer have to watch every motion. He stokes gently, adds kindling sparingly, shifts the pot when it boils too hard. At 14, you had already buried your own father. You remember what it felt like to be the one who must know. Whether you do or not, when breakfast ends, your family does not linger. Each person moves to their task, spinning, weaving, checking the cow in the byre, bringing in more wood. But the fire remains the center. Someone must always be near it. Feed it. Guard it. Keep it breathing. You're not afraid of wolves. You're not afraid of thieves. You're afraid of this. A morning when no one rises early enough. A spark that fails. And a silence where there should have been breath. And so, each day begins like this. Not with joy. Not with song. But with a ritual older than words. Protect the ember. Build the flame. Keep them warm. That is love. Here. And that is enough. It wasn't just the air. The cold was in everything. In the floor. In the walls. In the handle of the ladle you passed from one hand to another as if it might bite. In the breath you exhaled and watched hang there like a ghost that refused to leave. In the wooden spoon Isabel used to stir the pottage warped from years of heat, but still cold to the touch. You had grown used to it. You didn't like it, but you didn't fight it anymore. The cold always won. It seeped through the seams where the roof met the wall, through the cracks in the wattle and daub, through the places where mud had crumbled away and no one had the strength to pack more straw. Even the shutters, 2 thick planks tied with leather cord, could not keep it out. They only changed the way it sounded. When the wind howled, you could feel it before you heard it. It pushed against the house like an angry hand, and when it died down, the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise. Laurent had stuffed sheep's wool into the largest cracks, but wool was for socks, not walls. You had no cloth to spare. Everything had a purpose. Nothing could be wasted just to keep your toes from going blue. The children had learned not to complain. It wasn't that they weren't cold. It was that they understood complaining didn't make the fire grow. So instead, they huddled, close together, back to back, side to side. The small ones in the center, the older ones forming a wall around them, a human nest. They didn't play. They didn't speak much. Mostly, they just sat. Celia, your youngest, kept her fingers curled tight in her sleeves, her breath tucked into the collar of her dress. If she had mittens once, they were long gone now. She had learned to keep still so her toes wouldn't sting. You remembered the way your mother used to say it. The pain means they're still alive. It's when you feel nothing that you should worry. You had felt that once. Numbness, the quiet kind. When the cold reaches the bone and you stop feeling fingers or skin or sorrow. Just a kind of float, a kind of forgetting. You didn't want your children to feel that. So every evening, you did what you could. You made them laugh once a week. Maybe if the wind wasn't too loud. You told stories from the old days, or about a pig that got stuck in a door. or how your uncle once sneezed during church and knocked over a whole row of candles. You told them not because they were funny, most of them weren't. You told them so they could feel something warm on their face, even if it wasn't real heat, even if it was just the curl of a smile. Sometimes you made shadow puppets on the wall using the fire. The wolf, the hare, the crooked man with the long nose. The shadows danced on the soot-streaked walls like ghosts trying to remember how to be human. The cold didn't just sit on your skin. It crawled into your stomach too. You never felt full in winter, even when you ate enough to stay alive. The cold always felt like it was burning through your belly, stealing more than you had to give. You could eat 2 bowls of pottage and still feel hollow. It wasn't hunger, it was absence. A kind of quiet that grew inside you. That's what winter was, most of all. Not a storm, not a punishment, just a long, aching absence. The absence of birdsong, the absence of green, the absence of motion in the trees, except when the wind came, the absence of news, because no one travelled far enough to bring any. Even your thoughts slowed in the cold. Conversations with your wife became abbreviated. Gestures replaced words. A glance meant, "Is there more firewood?" A shrug meant no. A sigh meant, "Well, manage." You didn't need more language than that. Everyone knew what everyone else was feeling. That's what the cold did. It flattened the world. It made everything equal. Equally grey, equally quiet, equally afraid. You stepped outside one morning to check the snowpack on the roof. The air hit you like a slap. Inside, you had been cold. Outside, you were nothing. You could see your breath in long ribbons, white and winding, but even the breath seemed reluctant to leave you, as if it knew the air beyond your lips wasn't kind. The thatch roof had caught a drift nearly 2 feet thick, too heavy. You knew it had to come down before it soaked through and froze solid. A frozen thatch could crack a beam. Laurent followed you up the ladder. You didn't ask him. He just came, because winter taught you that asking wastes time. Together, you scraped the snow away with flat wooden paddles. The ice shattered in brittle sheets and fell with a satisfying thump to the ground. When you finished, you didn't speak, just nodded, just breathed, just went back inside. Later that night, you heard a cough. It wasn't Celia. It was Isabel. You didn't say anything. She wiped her nose with the hem of her sleeve and sat back down by the fire. You knew what she was thinking. 1 bad night was fine. 2 meant something worse. You looked at the firewood again. 4 logs left. 2 for tonight, 2 for tomorrow, then hope for a miracle. You've never understood why people write poems about snow. They say it's soft, gentle, quiet. But you know better. Snow is weight. Snow is work. Snow is silence that demands your attention. It fills your boots, dulls your axe. It piles against the wall of your home like a threat. And worst of all, snow lies. It looks like a blanket, but it's a tomb. Inside, though, there is still the fire. Not much of one. Just enough to keep your breath from freezing. Just enough to keep your family from curling into themselves and vanishing. And in the deepest part of night, when everyone else is asleep, you sit up and feed the last piece of dry birch to the flame. It hisses and cracks like something alive. You stay there, not because you're warm, but because it matters. Because someone must keep watch. Because cold waits for no one. The pig has no name. You made sure of that. A name would have made it a pet, and in a medieval winter, pets don't exist. Only mouths to feed, and this pig, it's too large to feed through February. Too costly to keep. Too valuable to lose. So this morning, the pig will die. Laurent is already tying the rope. He doesn't speak, but his hands know what to do. One around the snout, one around the hind leg. The pig squeals, sensing what's coming. They always do. Animals know the difference between routine and finality. Celia stays inside, tucked beneath blankets. Your wife, Isabel, holds her back when she tries to follow. Not today. Outside, the cold air sharpens the smell of straw and blood. The frost on the ground hasn't melted, though the sun has been up an hour. The fire under the iron cauldron is already burning. You started it before dawn. The water must be boiling hot enough to scald hair off hide, but not hot enough to cook. Timing is everything. You've done this before. Too many times. But it never feels easy. 2 men from the neighbouring cottage arrive to help. This is not a private task. Slaughtering is community work. Each family helps the others because no one can lift a grown pig alone, and no one can butcher quickly enough by themselves before the meat begins to spoil. It's not spoken, just known. Today, it's your pig. Next week, it may be theirs. The rope is tightened. The pig thrashes, squeals, the kind of sound that doesn't come from hunger or fear, but from the pure, guttural knowing that death is near. It writhes. You step in. You grip the hind leg. Another man takes the front. Laurent holds the snout tight, and then the knife. There is no ceremony, only stillness, and then a sudden jerk of the blade across the throat. The blood comes fast, thick, hot, pouring into the wooden bowl you've placed beneath. Every drop matters. Blood is not Waste-It's pudding, it's sausage filler, it's survival. Isabel will strain it through cloth, season it with sage, and cook it with barley by nightfall. If it clots too fast, it's useless. So you stir it gently as it steams in the cold morning air. The pig shudders once, twice, then stills. The steam from the blood hangs in the air like incense in a poor man's chapel. You look down at the animal not with guilt, but with something older. Respect. The kind that comes not from sentiment, but from knowing that this body may keep your children alive another month. You nod. The men help you carry the carcass to the ladder plank laid across 2 barrels. You work fast. Scald, scrape, gut, hang. Every step has a rhythm. You plunge the body into the cauldron for 10 seconds. Count in your head, not 11, not 9. The hair softens just enough. Then you scrape with the curved blade, the bristles peeling away like moss from stone. Laurent watches. His hands tremble slightly, not from cold, from the weight of knowing this is now his inheritance, the knowledge of killing, the knowledge of making use. Because here, to waste is to die. The guts are pulled carefully. A small nick in the wrong place and the bile will taint the meat. You've seen it happen. Green-black rot within hours. You go slow, methodical. Liver goes in one bowl, heart and kidneys in another. Fat is trimmed in thick white slabs gold to your wife's hands. Shell render it down, store it in jars, use it for cooking, for soap, for salve. Even the bladder is saved cleaned, dried, used to store dried herbs. Nothing is discarded. Even the feet are boiled. Even the bones are cracked for marrow. Even the ears. Even the tail. The head is split and the brain set aside. It's not noble work. It's not gruesome either. It's survival work. The kind that doesn't give you stories but gives you stew. By midday, the pig is gone. Not vanished. Just transformed. Laid out in bowls and cloths. Slabs of meat soaking in brine. Strips salted for drying. Organs steaming in the morning light. Buckets of fat. Piles of crackling. The 2 neighbours take their share not in meat, but in favour returned. In spring, you'll help them repair the fence, or dig ditches, or rethatch the roof. You don't need contracts here. You need memory. Isabel and Margaret clean the blood from the yard with buckets of snow and straw. Celia is still inside, eyes wide. You see the question in her face, but she doesn't ask. She saw the blood on your hands when you came in, and you didn't explain. Not because you were hiding it, but because here, every child learns meat is not bought, it is earned. That night, you eat warm for the first time in weeks. Pork liver, sliced and fried with onions. Blood pudding, still soft, steamed in cloth. A small cut of fat back, rendered into the soup. The taste fills your mouth. Not joy, not luxury, but fullness. You chew slowly. Your children lick their fingers. You and your wife don't speak much, but there is a look you share. We will make it through January. As you bank the fire that night, you glance toward the rafters. Tomorrow, the first slabs will hang there. Smoke will rise from the hearth day and night, curling into the meat, sealing it, preserving it. In 2 weeks, the flesh will turn dark and firm, and it will wait there silent, patient until the frost begins to thaw. You look at your hands. They smell of blood and wood smoke. They always do this time of year, but tonight, you don't wash them. You let the smell stay. So in the night, when you wake cold and hungry, you can hold your hand near your face and remember the pig was real. The warmth is earned, and nothing was wasted. You measure winter not by the calendar, but by the wood pile. Not the one out back, stacked neatly in rows. That one lies, It always looks full when it isn't. You measure it by what's left inside, by how many logs remain under the bench, by how many bundles of kindling are tied in the corner, by how many times your hand has reached into the same basket and come out with nothing. That's how you know what kind of winter it is. And this winter is the kind that makes people burn their chairs. You planned carefully. You always do. Each summer, when the ground is dry and the sun is long, you chop, you split, you haul, you dry. You build stacks as tall as your shoulder stacks that lean just slightly under their own weight, like tired men standing shoulder to shoulder. You rotate the oldest to the front. Let the sap bleed out. Let the bark curl back like paper. You mark the cords with notches so you don't burn the wrong wood too soon. And you pray quietly that what you've stored will be enough. But praying doesn't change the math, and the math this year is bad. The first mistake people make is thinking wood is just heat. It isn't. Wood is time. 1 log, 3 hours of bearable warmth, 1 basket, 1 evening with no frostbite, 1 cord, 10 days without the children coughing blood. It's a currency, more honest than gold, more sacred than coin. Because you can't eat gold, you can't burn it. It won't keep your daughter's fingers from turning blue in her sleep. Laurent carries in 3 logs before breakfast. His hands are raw beneath his mittens, the skin cracking open at the knuckles. That's all I could reach without stepping into the drift, he says. You nod. The pile outside is covered in snow 2 feet thick, frozen solid. You'll need to chip it free, 1 piece at a time, but you also can't waste the good wood now. Not while the roof still holds, not while the frost hasn't climbed down the inside of the walls. Isabel watches you count what's left beside the hearth. 7 logs. That's less than 3 days if you're careful. 1 day if the wind turns cruel. There are rules about wood. Not written rules, just lived ones. Rule 1, never burn green wood. It smokes. It stings the eyes. It leaves creosote in the rafters. It teaches you regret. Rule 2, never burn everything at once, even if you're cold enough to cry. Warm now means freezing later. Rule 3, if you run out of dry wood, you burn whatever you must, even if it once had legs, even if someone carved it with love. Even if it used to be the cradle your daughter slept in. You've already used the old spinning wheel, the broken footstool, a few shelves from the back wall, once used for drying herbs. You still have the bench, the ladder, 1 bed frame, and, if it comes to it, a beam from the roof. It sounds unthinkable. But it's not. Not when someone you love is shaking so hard they can't hold a spoon. Not when the air in the house feels colder than the snow outside. Not when your wife presses her hands to her stomach just to stop the ache of shivering. You'll burn whatever you must. One night, years ago, you visited a neighbour just before sunset. His wife was sick. His children were sick. And his house smelled like smoke, but not wood smoke. It smelled like wool, paint, varnish, sweat. They'd burned the door, they'd burned the table, they'd burned the floorboards from the corner of the room. And still, it hadn't been enough. That man died in spring. Not from cold, but from what the cold did to his pride. You remember that night more clearly than any sermon you've ever heard. This morning, you and Laurent go to the tree line. The snow comes up to your knees. It sticks to your boots. It slows every step until it feels like walking through grain sacks. The axe is heavier than you remember. Laurent says nothing. Neither do you. The branches you find are small, twigs. Nothing that will last more than an hour. But it's something. And that's the only thing worth saying. You fill 2 bundles. Laurent carries both. Back at home, Isabel is soaking a scrap of burlap in fat, twisting it into a wick for the rushlight. She's quiet, focused. She moves with the kind of precision only winter teaches. No extra motion, no wasted energy. When she sees the twigs, she doesn't smile. She just nods and sets the kettle on to boil. Celia is asleep by the hearth, wrapped in the last clean wool. Her lips are chapped. Her breathing is shallow. You toss 2 small sticks into the fire. They hiss. They smoke. They flame. They buy you another half hour of warmth. You know what spring looks like. You remember it. But that memory feels dishonest in your hands. Like something you borrowed and forgot to return. Like a lie you told yourself in August that December has now disproven. Because in winter, the only colour is firelight. The only music is the crack of burning wood. The only future is whether or not you'll have fuel to last the week. And when Laurent asks you quietly, After dinner, can we use the bookshelf tomorrow? You pause. You think of the books gone long ago, traded for salt. You think of the splinters you'll get pulling nails from old wood. You think of your hands, your wife, your daughter, the frost forming on the inside of the shutters, and you say yes. Because in this house, in this winter, the question isn't what something was. It's what it's worth in heat, in hours, in survival. And that shelf it's worth one more night. That makes it priceless. The fire is alive. The wood holds out, just barely. And the walls, well, they do their best. But what really kills you in winter isn't cold. It's the wind. Because wind is never still, never quiet, never seen. It doesn't walk in through the door like a hungry man. It slips in sideways, between things, beneath things, under your skin, into your ribs, and behind your eyes before you ever notice it's there. You can't reason with the wind. And once it gets in, it's already too late. It always begins the same way, not with sound, but with movement. A curtain trembles, though no one touched it. The straw underfoot shifts, though no one walked. A candle flickers, though no breath was blown. And then you hear it. Not a howl, but a whisper. A long, slow breath pressed against the boards, as if the world outside were sighing against the house, testing its strength. Sometimes it howls like a beast. Sometimes it moans like a widow. But most days it just hisses, endless, low, relentless. The kind of sound that drills into you. Not loud, but deep, like something scratching behind the walls of your own mind. Isabel noticed it first this morning. She'd been up early, kneading dough near the hearth, when she paused, not for a sound, for an absence. There was a spot just left of the window where her ankles had gone cold, and not the usual morning cold. This was something sharper, something with a direction. She pressed her palm to the plaster, felt nothing, then bent lower. It was coming through the seam, down where the wattle met the floorboards, not visible, but moving. She stuffed it with straw, pressed a cloth against it, lit a second rushlight, not for light but for heat. Still, the air wouldn't settle. By mid-morning, you could feel it too. The room had two temperatures now, one near the hearth soft, almost kind, and one everywhere else cold as iron, sharp as teeth. You moved your chair closer to the fire, not out of luxury, but necessity. And when Celia tried to follow, Isabel pulled her back. The smoke was rising badly today. The wind had changed direction, pushing the hearth's own breath back down into the room. Everyone's eyes burned. No one complained. You know wind better than you know people. You can tell what it wants by the sound it makes when it moves across the roof. A high-pitched whistle means dry snow. A rumble in the walls means it's going to break something. But the worst is when it just seeps. You can't tell where it begins or ends. It just exists, like grief. Laurent nailed an old cloth over the window shutter. It helped, a little. But the corners still lifted like tongues, mocking you. You tried sealing the door frame with dried moss, but the gap between the boards had widened with frost. You considered moving the bedding again, closer to the fire. But last night, Isabel had said no, not because she didn't want to be warm, but because if you got used to sleeping beside the fire, you wouldn't want to leave it. And people who don't leave the fire stop working, stop gathering, stop preparing, and then they stop surviving. In the afternoon, a strange thing happened. You opened the door to fetch a bucket of packed snow for boiling and found that the drifts had pressed themselves against the house. Waist high, heavy, packed tight along the base of the wall. For a moment, you cursed. You'd need to shovel just to walk. But then you noticed something. The house was warmer, not by much, but enough to feel it. It didn't make sense, but it was real. Isabel noticed too. She crouched beside the wall and ran her fingers along the door. The cold was softer, insulated. Snow is strange. You grow up thinking it means cold, but in truth, snow keeps you alive. It's not the air that's deadly, it's the wind. And snow, heavy and wet, blocks wind. It builds up along the walls, forming a silent barrier. It fills the cracks. It covers the gaps. It shields you from the invisible teeth outside. You don't shovel it away. You pile it higher, like a mother tucking blankets around a sick child. Laurent and Margaret spent an hour scooping snow to the base of the north wall. Not because you asked, because they understood. No one teaches you these things. They're just passed down like recipes, or scars. By evening, the wind grew louder, but inside the room stayed still. The fire burned steady, no smoke pushed back, no curtain danced, and the silence inside the house was not peace, but the absence of war. You sat together by the hearth. No one said the word warm, but no one shook, either. That was enough. After dinner, you walked around the room, checking every edge, every seam, stuffed straw into the cracks, pressed your fingers to the shutter slats, felt for breath that didn't belong. Isabel watched you and whispered, "We're sealed in." You nodded. It's safer that way. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the snow clung to your house like a second skin. And for the first time in weeks, you didn't feel like the wind was winning. Not tonight. You lay down beside your wife, wrapped in 3 blankets, your back to the fire. The children curled around each other, a nest of limbs and breath. You heard the wind outside. It growled, it rattled, it tried, but it couldn't get in. Not yet. And in that small mercy, you fell asleep. The pot doesn't boil its size. Steam curls upward from its mouth like breath from a tired horse. Inside, the porridge is more water than grain. Oats so thin they disappear into the broth, leaving behind only a suggestion of sustenance. It smells faintly of salt, faintly of ash. It smells of winter. You ladle it out slowly, 1 scoop per bowl. You don't need to be told how much is left. You already know by the weight in your wrist. Each bowl looks the same grey, thin, hot. No one says they're hungry, but no one looks away from the bowls either. Celia is the first to ask, "Why is it thinner today?" Her voice is soft, curious, not yet afraid. She's too young to understand rations. She still expects meals to match what she remembers. Isabel glances at you across the table. You don't answer right away. What are you supposed to say? Because we have to make it last. Because the oat sack is almost empty. Because the wind howled all night and we burned more wood than we should have. Because life isn't fair. Because this is winter. You give her the only answer that doesn't make it worse, so it stretches longer. She nods, dips her spoon, blows, eats. Children accept more than they should. The bread is worse. Black as old soil, dense, hard. It takes effort to chew and leaves grit behind in your teeth. The crust flakes, not because it's crisp but because it's dried out. It's made of rye, barley, and a flour ground by hand 2 days ago. Coarse as sand. It's not moulded yet, so you call it fresh. You slice it thin. So thin you can see light through parts of it. Margaret studies her piece before eating. She doesn't complain, but her eyes give her away. She remembers white bread, not every day but once, maybe twice a year for holy days. Bread made from wheat so fine it almost shimmered, soft inside, pale, a luxury. That kind of bread is gone now. Wheat costs more than you earn in a month. The miller won't even look at your family this time of year unless you bring something special to trade. You'd need cheese, or eggs, or a wheel of soap, and you have none. So you eat the dark bread, because dark bread doesn't ask you who you are, it feeds you anyway. Laurent eats in silence, not because he's angry, but because eating takes concentration now. You watch him chew. Each bite is slow, careful. He holds the spoon in his left hand, the crust of bread in his right. Alternates, soup, bite, chew, soup again. His lips are cracked. You can see where the cold split them in the night. You want to say something. You want to give him more. But there is no more. Hunger in winter doesn't shout. It doesn't claw at you like it does in summer, when your belly is empty but the air is warm and your legs still have strength. Winter hunger is quieter. It curls around your spine and settles. It steals your colour. It dulls your sight. It turns meals into numbers, into minutes, into silent calculations. If we eat this now, will we have enough for Sunday? If we skip meat this week, can we save it for Celia's cough? If we dig deeper in the root cellar, will we find anything not spoiled and so no one asks for more? Because everyone knows there isn't any. You used to eat 3 meals a day. Now you eat 2. 1 if the weather turns. Even the cow has noticed. She gives less milk. She moans more. Her bones are showing under her hide. You save the best hay for her, because if she goes, everything goes. Margaret offered to give up her morning portion last week. You said no. You told her that strength now means survival later. But the truth is you just didn't want to see her hungrier than she already is. After breakfast, the bowls are cleaned with hot water and scraps of straw. The water is saved to mop the floor. Nothing is wasted, not heat, not moisture, not food, not even silence. Because silence is easier than explaining. It's easier than saying this is the best we can do. It's easier than promising it'll be better tomorrow when it might not be. Outside, the wind has quieted, but the sky stays the colour of tin. You step out to check the traps near the edge of the trees. Nothing. No rabbit. No squirrel. Just snow and brittle tracks. When you return, Celia is asking again. Will we have bread tomorrow? Isabel answers before you do. We'll bake again. With what we have, it's not a yes. It's not a no. But Celia smiles, because it sounds like hope. You can't bring yourself to correct her. That night, after the second meal, the same porridge, slightly thicker, you slice the last bit of cheese. You don't announce it. You just cut it carefully into even slivers, one for each person, a piece the size of a coin. Celia's eyes go wide. Margaret leans closer. Laurent says nothing, but eats his slower than usual. The cheese is salty, strong, rich. The only thing on the table that tastes like it belongs in a different season. It melts on the tongue. And for 5 minutes, no one is thinking about black bread. Later, when the children are asleep, you and Isabel sit beside the fire. She's darning socks. You're sharpening the blade of the skinning knife. Not for a pig. Not yet. Maybe never. But a blade kept sharp is hope. 2. She looks at you. Her eyes tired. Her fingers raw from wool and thread. Do you think we'll make it? You don't lie. I think we're trying. She nods and keeps sewing, and you keep sharpening. Because what else can you do? The wheel doesn't sing. It clicks. Soft, dull. Over and over a click, whir, click. Margaret's foot keeps time on the treadle. Her fingers move with a kind of muscle memory that's older than her. She doesn't look at the thread anymore. She watches the fire instead. The flame dances. The wheel turns. Outside. Snow falls in silence, and inside, the only sound is the spinning. Celia is nearby, pulling tangles from raw wool. Her hands are clumsy but careful. Every now and then, she looks up, watching her sister's fingers turn clouds into string. Why does it go twisty? She asks. Margaret doesn't look down, so it holds together. Wouldn't it hold without twisting? No. Celia nods slowly. She doesn't really understand, but the answer is gentle, and that's enough. The fibre slips through Margaret's fingers. The wheel turns. Her foot never stops. In the corner, Isabel is darning a sock. Again. The same one she fixed 3 weeks ago. The wool has thinned at the heel. It keeps happening. Not from neglect, but from use. Too much walking on cold floors. Too many nights with only one layer between flesh and frost. She sighs. Threads the needle again. Pulls the yarn through. Tightens the stitch. She doesn't curse. Doesn't grumble. She just mends. Because if she stops even for a day, the hole will grow. And winter has no patience for holes. You're working too. Carving a new handle for the grain scoop. The old one splintered yesterday. You saved the wood. It may be useful for kindling, but you need a replacement before the flour sack empties completely. The handle doesn't have to be beautiful. Just strong. Smooth enough not to crack. Long enough not to dip your fingers into precious flour. The room is quiet. The only conversation is between hands and tools, and the wheel. Click. Whir. Click. Spinning. Mending. Carving. Fixing. None of it is urgent. But all of it matters. Because there's a kind of madness that comes in February. It doesn't scream. It drips. Drip. Drip. Drip like meltwater that never truly melts. Like silence that presses on your chest just hard enough to remind you how long it's been since you last saw green. Work helps. Not the kind of work that saves lives, not hunting, not cooking, not gathering, but the kind that gives shape to days. The kind that lets your fingers remember what your mind wants to forget. Margaret used to hum while she worked. She doesn't anymore. Not since the frost took the old cat. Not since the roof nearly caved in from snow weight. Not since she overheard you and Isabel whispering about the last salt. But she spins. Every day. You sharpened the spindle head last week. Cleaned the wheel axle. You don't say it aloud, but you know the spinning wheel is keeping her sane. It gives her something to start, something to finish, something to touch. In a season where touch means survival, Celia sneezes. Margaret pauses, mid-spin. "You're too close to the draft," she says. "I like watching." Margaret doesn't argue. She just leans to pull the shawl from the peg, drapes it over Celia's shoulders. The thread tangles slightly. She doesn't curse, just smooths it out, breathes slowly, starts again. Isabel glances up from her sewing. "Did you dream again she's speaking to you?" You blink, realizing you haven't moved in several minutes. The knife rests still in your lap, the handle unfinished. You nod. Same one, you nod again. Flooded fields. You shake your head. Fire. No one asks more. No one needs to, because everyone's having dreams now, and they're all bad. Margaret clears her throat. "Saw a figure at the edge of the woods yesterday. You turn. Animal." She shrugs. "Could have been." Celia shivers. "I heard bells last night," she says. "There weren't any bells." You reply gently. "I know." And that's the end of it. The wheel keeps turning. Click. Whir. Click. Later, Margaret switches tasks. She unwinds what she's spun, lays it out to dry. It will be dyed later, maybe. If spring brings anything with colour, right now, it stays the shade of bone. Isabel pulls another sock from the basket. "This one is yours, hole at the toe." She frowns at it, then frowns at you. "I told you not to walk barefoot. You don't respond. You were half asleep. Needed to check the shutter. It wasn't worth waking anyone." But now she has to patch it. So she does, because this is what love looks like. Here, it looks like socks stitched in silence. Outside, the snow deepens. Inside, the room holds steady. You don't talk about tomorrow's meal. You don't talk about the last of the barley. You don't talk about the rat that chewed through the corner of the grain chest. You just work. Because the only thing worse than breaking is stopping long enough to feel it. When Celia finally falls asleep in the chair, head resting on your arm, you realize the wheel has stopped. Not broken, just resting. Margaret sets it down, rubs her palms, her fingers red and stiff, her eyes dull with exhaustion. No one speaks. The silence is full but not heavy. It's the kind that only comes after doing something however small that helped. You set the unfinished scoop handle aside. You'll complete it tomorrow. Tonight, you've done enough. Tonight, the wool is spun, the socks are mended, the house is intact, the minds are quiet. No one laughed, but no one cried either. That counts. That's enough. They live in the goat shed now, not because they have goats, but because there's nowhere else to put them. The main house is full of grandchildren, of sacks of grain, of silence no one wants to break. The hearth belongs to younger backs, younger lungs, younger appetites. So Aldrich and Lynette sleep on straw, a single blanket between them. A chipped cup of soup passed through the door each evening like an apology. No words, just the scrape of wood on wood, then footsteps retreating. No one says it aloud, but everyone knows they've been put aside, like broken tools, like shoes too stiff to mend, like memories that take up too much space. Lynette can't feel her fingers in the mornings. The cold has settled in her joints like moss on stones low, quiet, unstoppable. When she tries to stand, her knees tremble. So she sits, most of the day, wrapped in whatever wool Aldrich can spare from his own shoulders. He still tries, still wakes before her, still knocks snow from the roof with a broom so it won't collapse, still brings in kindling from the edge of the path. He acts as if they're still wanted, as if he's still needed, as if his son might change his mind. But his son will not this winter. The decision was made weeks ago. Rationing began, bread shrank, the porridge stretched thin, voices lowered to whispers behind doors, eyes stopped meeting across the table, and one morning, Aldrich's bowl simply wasn't filled. No argument, no shouting, just an empty ladle. He understood, didn't ask, didn't wait for Lynette to be served either. He just stood, took her hand, and walked out. No drama, just dignity. The goat shed hadn't been used in years. The floor was packed earth. The walls leaned inward slightly, as if trying to stay warm. He swept the worst of the cobwebs, stuffed rags in the holes, lined the floor with pine branches and straw, hung an old woolen cloak across the doorframe to keep the wind out. Lynette didn't say much, just sat, wrapped her shawl tighter. Her lips trembled, but from cold or sorrow. No one could tell. The villagers noticed, of course, but they didn't speak, not out of cruelty, out of familiarity, because it wasn't new. It happened last year too, to the widow, Claire, to old Merrick and his sister, to the lame shepherd who used to hum at market. Winter isn't cruel, it's consistent, and when food runs low, the old become heavy, not just in body, in guilt. And the younger ones, though they might ache inside, learn to let go. Some say it's mercy, some say it's shame. Most say nothing at all. You remember when Aldrich built the church roof? 37 years ago. His hands were twice the size of yours, thick with cord and bone. He climbed the rafters like he was born there, laughed when the rain came down mid-construction. Worked through the storm anyway. Now he struggles to lift a bucket of water. Now he coughs at night deep, rattling. Now he is forgotten. And somehow, that forgetting feels worse than death. Margaret brought him a heel of bread last week. She didn't ask. Just slipped out after supper, hid it in her apron, left it by the shed door. Didn't even knock. The next morning, the bread was gone. She didn't speak of it, but her eyes were rimmed red at breakfast. Celia doesn't understand yet. She still waves at Aldrich when she sees him, still asks why he doesn't come for dinner anymore, still tells stories about how he used to carve whistles from elderwood. You tell her he's resting, that he needs quiet, that she'll see him again in spring, and then you look away, because lying tastes bitter in winter. Lynette used to sing in church, softly, sweetly. She doesn't sing now. She hums, sometimes low, barely audible, like bees trapped under glass. But most of the time, she just sits, eyes closed, as if pretending to sleep is easier than staying awake. Isabel sewed them a pair of mittens from scraps, left them on a post near the shed. Lynette wears hers. Aldrich gave his to her too. You saw him rubbing his hands raw last week, trying to coax a flame from damp kindling. Didn't ask, didn't offer, because what could you give him? A blanket you don't have, a place at a table already stretched thin, a miracle. Last night, a fox crept near their door. You heard it, heard Aldrich chasing it off with a stick and a cracked pan lid. The sound was pitiful. Clang, shout, cough, but it worked. The fox fled, and Aldrich stood outside in the snow for 10 minutes after, just breathing hard, as if daring the night to take something else from him. You watched from the window, didn't move, just whispered his name. He couldn't hear it. This morning, you left a jar of broth beside the woodpile, just in case he passed by. You told yourself it was coincidence, but it wasn't. It never is. In spring, they'll say they were old. It was time, but you'll remember the sound of his cough, the way Lynette's hands trembled when she tried to hold a spoon, the way their son avoided looking anyone in the eye. You'll remember what winter did, not with violence, but with quiet decisions, with soup bowls that stayed half full, with blankets that didn't stretch far enough, with excuses whispered in the name of necessity. And most of all, you'll remember this truth. The world does not end in screams. It ends in the sound of two people being left outside, and everyone pretending not to hear it. It happened in the night, not with a cry, not with a struggle, just a breath that never came back. Aldrich died with his back against the shed wall, sitting up, blanket pulled up to his chin, eyes closed, hands folded in his lap like he was still waiting for morning. Lynette didn't notice right away. She was dreaming. In the dream, she was 15 again, gathering herbs along the summer ridge with her mother, sunlight hot on her neck. She woke cold, reached for his hand, and found it stiff. She didn't scream, didn't run, just pressed her lips together and stared at his face. Long, quiet. Then she stood slowly and walked to the door, opened it just wide enough to let in the wind, then closed it again. She didn't want him to be cold, even now. Word spread, not through voices but through glances. A bucket left untouched by the well, a folded shawl returned without explanation, a door left slightly open. By midday, everyone knew, and no one spoke of it. Not directly. Isabel lit a small candle and placed it in the window. Margaret dropped 2 handfuls of juniper into the hearth to keep the smell from drifting in. You walked past the shed once, Twiss. Didn't go in. Didn't knock. You weren't sure if Lynette would answer. You weren't sure what you'd say if she did. There was no burial. The ground was stone. The frost had sunk deep 4 feet, maybe more. The tools couldn't break it. The earth gave nothing, not a whisper, not a flake. And so Aldrich stayed where he was, in the shed, covered with a second blanket. Lynette refused to leave him, said she'd stay until the thaw, said she wasn't cold, but she was. You saw it in her hands, purple at the fingertips, too still. Celia asked why they didn't take him to the churchyard. You tried to explain, but how do you explain frozen earth to a child who still believes the dead sleep under flowers? Well, bury him when spring comes, Isabel said gently. Celia frowned. But he's not supposed to wait. He's supposed to go now. No one had an answer. By evening, the smell had started. Not strong, not yet, but present. It moved like smoke, curled through the cracks in the doorframe, hung in the straw like breath that wouldn't leave. You couldn't escape it. Not in the pottage, not in the bread, not even in your sleep. The scent of death finds its way into everything. That night, Lynette sang, soft, broken, a lullaby from long ago before famine, before frost, before suns turned away. Celia heard it from her bed. Who's singing? She asked. Margaret said nothing. Isabel just pulled the blankets tighter. You listened. You listened until the voice stopped, and then you stared at the ceiling and wished you hadn't. Lynette joined him 3 days later. No one found her until midday. She was curled beside him, forehead resting on his shoulder. She hadn't eaten, hadn't moved. The candle she lit beside his feet had long since burned out. No fire, no warmth, just silence, and frost on the inside of the walls. You wrapped her in a cloth and laid her beside him. Still, the earth would not give. So you boarded the shed door, not sealed, just closed. You didn't want the wolves. Margaret cried when no one was watching, not for Aldrich, not for Lynette, but because she'd realised someday someone would close a door like that behind you, behind her, behind anyone who lived too long in the wrong season. By the 5th night, the smell thickened. It wasn't grotesque, just wrong, like milk turned or wet straw left too long. It mixed with the air, with the fire, with the bread. When Celia wrinkled her nose at supper, no one corrected her. She looked at you. Is the meat bad? You shook your head. It's fine, and chewed slower. In the dark, when the fire had burned low and the house was hushed again, Isabel asked, do you think they were afraid you didn't answer? Not because you didn't know, but because you did. Death in winter isn't sudden. It's gradual, like light fading from the sky, like frost creeping up the walls, like hunger that starts in the stomach and ends in the soul. You don't fear it like a knife. You fear it like forgetting, like being left outside, like being known, then slowly unknown. Lynette once said she hoped she'd go in her sleep. She did, but not in peace, because peace requires people, and she had none left. The village adjusted quickly. The shed became off limits. Children were told not to play near it. The path to it faded under snow, and the door, that old wooden door with its crooked latch, became a kind of unspoken gravestone. In March, when the earth began to soften, you would dig. You would open that door again. You would remember. You would carry what was left. You would lay it into thawing soil. You would speak no eulogy. Only they tried. They didn't deserve it. Let the ground be kinder than the cold. But for now, you sleep with death in the straw, in the food, in the corners of the house. You hear it when the wind shifts, smell it when the fire burns low, feel it in your bones. Not fear, not mourning, just the breath of something cold and final and still. It had been saved for months, wrapped in cloth, tucked into the corner of the grain chest, hidden behind jars of dried herbs and the last of the honey. It was never touched. Not for church, not for feast days, not even when the sewing needle was lost and the rushlight sputtered out, because it was the last. And when something is the last, it becomes sacred. Celia's fever started 2 nights ago. At first, you thought it was the heat from the fire, reflecting strangely on her cheeks. But by morning, her lips were dry and cracked, and her breath came fast and shallow. Isabel stayed beside her all day, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. whispering songs with no tune. Margaret fetched more snow, melted it, stirred in dried pine needles for a weak tea. You crushed juniper with the back of a spoon and pressed the powder into her gums, but the fever climbed anyway. By dusk, her skin glowed with heat. Her body shivered under 3 layers of wool, and her eyes, they no longer looked at you. They looked through you. You lit the candle, not because you needed to see, but because you needed something to believe in. It stood only 6 inches tall, pale yellow, hand-dipped, the kind made months ago from leftover wax and animal fat, twisted around a rag wick. It wasn't beautiful, but it burned, and in that moment, it felt like a miracle. The light it gave was small, too small to read by, too small to chase shadows from corners, but it was enough to see her face, enough to see the sweat on her neck, enough to see the quiver in Isabel's lip as she dabbed another cloth. And that was all you asked for. No one spoke when you lit it. Margaret's hand stilled over her stitching. Laurent sat up straighter, eyes on the flame. Celia didn't stir. The house changed, not louder, but more awake, as if something ancient had opened its eyes and was watching too. The candle flickered with every breath of wind that came through the thatch. You moved it closer to the hearth, then shielded it with a cup. It guttered, caught, kept burning. You remember the last time you used a candle like this? It was the night of the stillbirth, 4 winters ago. You held Isabel's hand while she clenched her teeth and said nothing. Not a cry, not a scream. The candle was the only thing that heard her pain. When it finally went out, so did the heartbeat. You didn't light another one for a long time after that. Until now, Celia murmured something in her sleep. You couldn't catch it. It might have been a name. It might have been nonsense. It might have been goodbye. You stroked her hair and said nothing. Sometimes words are a kind of betrayal, as if naming the fear gives it permission. So you held your tongue. Margaret brought over a basin of warm water. She dipped a cloth, wrung it out, pressed it gently to Celia's chest. The steam rose in ribbons. The candlelight caught in the droplets. For a moment, her little body glistened like morning frost. Isabel hummed again, an old lullaby, one you hadn't heard in years, one you didn't remember teaching her. The candle burned lower. Its base began to melt, forming a shallow pool around the clay holder. You tilted it slightly, just enough to save the wick. Celia coughed once, then again, sharp, dry, like cloth tearing. Her breath rattled afterward. You whispered her name. Her eyes fluttered open, just for a second, long enough to look at the flame. She smiled, not big, not strong, but real. And then her eyes closed again. You all saw it, the smile, the glance, the candle, and suddenly, the room felt less like a deathbed and more like a vigil, like a waiting room for hope. Laurent reached for another log. You shook your head. The fire didn't need feeding. The candle was enough now. Celia slept through the night, her breath uneven, but steady. Margaret stayed curled beside her. Isabel dozed with one hand wrapped around the girl's foot, as if anchoring her to the world. You sat by the fire, watching the candle shrink, minute by minute, like a timer no one wanted to finish. At dawn, the wick bent sideways. The flame leaned. Then it flickered and died. No smoke, no sound. Just a faint scent of wax and tallow, and then only grey. But Celia was breathing. Still hot, still weak, but breathing. You whispered thank you to the cold air, to no one, to whatever heard. That morning, you did not mourn the candle. You were grateful, because it had done something no medicine could. It had held the room together, held the breath, held the waiting. And when Celia woke that afternoon sweaty, confused, and hungry, Isabel cried in silence. Laurent laughed, then quickly covered his mouth. Margaret fed her broth by the spoonful. You kissed the top of her head, even though it still burned hot, and in your mind, you saw the candle, still burning, even though it wasn't there, because light doesn't have to last forever. It only has to last long enough. The fire was low, not dying, just tired. It glowed like a sleeping heartbeat, pulsing faint light across the floor. No one was talking, not because they were asleep, but because there was nothing left to say. The house was warm enough. Celia's fever had broken. The wind outside had slowed to a sigh, and still, something about the silence felt dangerous. Like if it lasted too long, it would start to hollow them out from the inside. So Margaret spoke. Not loudly, not with ceremony, just speaking quietly without looking up from her stitching. Once, in the frozen forest, there lived a woman made of snow. Celia's head stirred on Isabel's lap. A snow woman, she whispered. Margaret nodded. She had no name, no heart, just two hollow eyes and hair made of mist. Every winter she woke up, and every spring she melted. You didn't stop her, didn't tell her it was too late, didn't warn her not to scare the child, because you knew what this was. It wasn't a bedtime story. It was insulation, a shield against the cold. The tale was old, older than Margaret, probably older than anyone still alive in the village. You'd heard it yourself, as a boy half asleep under pelts, shivering, staring at a ceiling dark with soot. You remembered the cadence. You remembered the feeling, a story that wasn't for children but for the winter. The snow woman, Margaret said, would wander through the woods searching for something she couldn't name. She didn't feel pain, didn't feel love, only the cold and the faint memory of having once been warm. She would knock on cottage doors and listen through the cracks. If she heard laughter, she stayed away. If she heard silence, she came in. And when she left, there would be frost on the windows and someone missing from the beds. Celia pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders. Is she real? Margaret didn't answer. That was part of the spell. You never said yes. You never said no. You just kept telling it, because telling was the point. Isabel reached for her spindle, though she didn't spin. Just held it. Let it rest in her hand like a talisman. Laurent leaned against the wall, eyes half closed, listening like he was trying not to. The story continued. One day, the snow woman found a lantern in the forest, a real one, lit. It sat in the snow, warm and gold and flickering. She crouched beside it, watched it dance, and for the first time she cried, not tears of water, but of light. They say she melted, not from the sun, not from heat, but from remembering what it meant to feel. There was a long pause, the kind that settles like dust after a long breath. Then Celia asked, "What happened to the lantern?" Margaret smiled faintly. "No one knows. Maybe it's still out there," Celia said. Her voice sounded stronger than it had all week. You looked at her cheeks. They were flushed but with warmth, not fever. Fairy tales aren't told for truth. They are told because winter is long and words can spark where fire cannot. You remembered your own mother's voice, cracked with age, whispering stories about frost spirits, shadow wolves, and children who turned into stars if they walked too far from home. You never believed them, but you never forgot them, either, after Margaret's story ended. No one moved. The house didn't feel warmer, but it felt less alone, like the walls were listening, like the darkness outside was being held back by something invisible but real. Celia eventually drifted off again. Her thumb curled near her mouth. Laurent added a stick to the fire. It hissed, caught, and glowed. Margaret returned to her stitching. Isabel rested her head against your shoulder, and the story, though finished, stayed, hanging in the air like breath that didn't want to leave. You didn't believe in snow women. Not really. You didn't believe in frost spirits or whispering winds or trees that talked. But you believed in telling, because telling made it bearable, made it survivable, made it endurable, and maybe, just maybe, that was the point. Not to convince anyone that magic was real, but to remind them that hope was, even if it came in the shape of a melted ghost or a lantern that cried. Later, when the fire burned low again, Margaret whispered another tale, quieter this time, about a dog that swallowed the stars, about a boy who carved a sun from ice. No one interrupted, no one corrected, and no one noticed the moment when sleep overtook them all. The stories kept going even after the lips stopped moving, because stories don't end when they're told. They echo, they heat the air, they wrap around bones and settle into memory like wool against the skin. Outside, the frost grew thicker, the wind forgot its way, and in the little cottage that barely held together, 5 breathing bodies survived another night, not with strength, not with certainty, but with a story, Because in the end, the cold doesn't win when the fire is strong, but when the stories stop, and tonight they didn't stop. Not yet. The church had no fire. It never did. Its walls were stone, thick and unmoving. The floor was frozen earth. The windows were narrow slits meant more for defense than light. Inside, the breath of 50 villagers rose like incense and vanished among the rafters, where frost clung like spiderwebs spun by saints long dead. It was Sunday, so they came, not because they were devout, but because they didn't know what else to do. Laurent walked ahead of you, boots crunching in the snow, carrying the bread wrapped in cloth. Isabella tucked the smallest piece of dried fruit inside. It wasn't for flavour, it was for remembering. Celia held your hand. Her fingers were warmer this week, but she still coughed in the morning. The others followed in silence, wrapped in grey, brown and black. The villagers' palette had faded along with the sun. No one wore colour anymore. Not in February. The bell rang once, twice. Its sound was flat and heavy, as if even metal was tired of this season. Inside the nave, they sat where they always sat. Same benches, same order, not assigned, just known. Children huddled beside mothers, fathers pressed close at the ends, shoulders squared as if to shield everyone from an enemy they couldn't name. The priest entered. His cloak was threadbare, his fingers blue at the knuckles. He carried a book so worn the pages looked like dried skin. He didn't speak at first, just nodded, then began. The Latin fell like dust. Dominus vobiscum. He raised his hand. They lowered their heads. Not 1 in 10 understood the words, but everyone listened, because it wasn't about understanding. It was about remembering how to listen. The prayers came in waves, rehearsed, rhythmic. Each syllable rang against the walls like stone chipping stone. You said them with your mouth, not with your heart, but you said them anyway, because silence would feel colder. Celia watched the priest with wide eyes. "Is he cold too?" she whispered. You nodded. Even God's man shivered. The church had no heat, but it had ritual, and that was something ancient, something shared. You didn't need to believe to be part of it. You just needed to stay standing. When the priest offered the blessing, his voice cracked. He was old, older than Aldrich had been, but still standing, still speaking the same words over the same people who grew thinner and quieter with each passing week. Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus. The bells of heaven were silent, but the echoes in this stone box answered back. Someone began to cry. Not loudly, just the soft kind. The kind you try to swallow but can't. No one looked. They just folded their hands tighter and stared at the floor, because everyone was thinking the same thing. If we stop showing up, does that mean we've given up? The bread was passed forward, stale, cracked, sacred anyway. The priest dipped it in wine, barely more than a breath on the tongue, red like blood, but only in colour. The wine came from a jug that had lasted longer than most marriages. You watched as Laurent took his piece, then Margaret, then Celia, who was too young but held out her hand anyway. The priest paused, then placed the crumb in her palm, a mercy, a prayer, a memory, outside. The snow hadn't stopped. Inside. No one warmed, but they were together, and that was the only thing holding them upright. You remembered being young laughing in the pews, being scolded for whispering during Mass, tugging on your mother's sleeve asking when it would end. Now you just sat, still, like stone among stone, like frost among frost. The Latin returned. Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God. You pictured a real lamb, wet with birth, shivering in the cold. You wondered if God ever froze. After the benediction, no one rushed to leave. Not because they wanted to stay, but because the wind was worse outside. So they lingered, spoke in low voices, asked after each other's root cellars, mentioned dry coughs, talked about nothing that mattered and everything that did. Celia clung to your leg. You felt her cheek, just to be sure. Still warm, still safe. The priest sat on the edge of the altar, his hands wrapped in his sleeves. He didn't speak to anyone, just stared at the candle stub near the crucifix. It had burned all through service. You wondered how many he had left. On the way home, no one said much. The snow fell heavier. The wind picked up. Margaret hummed to him quietly to herself. It wasn't joyful, but it helped. Isabel held Celia close and whispered the same Latin words she didn't understand. And you stared at the white-covered path and thought of Aldrich, of Lynette, of all the names that had once been called aloud in this church, names now buried in frost and memory. You didn't believe, not really, but you returned each week, not because you feared hell, not because you hoped for heaven, but because the church was the only place where everyone still knelt at the same time, and in that unity there was a kind of warmth that no fire could give. You were alone, but you were not the only one alone, and sometimes that was enough. It began with a bean and a loaf of bread, simple, silly, even. One single dry bean hidden inside a rough round of barley dough. No flour to spare for wheat, no sugar for sweetness, but that didn't matter, because on this one day whoever found the bean became king. It was the Feast of Epiphany, January 6th, the day the Magi arrived in the storybooks, the day the old year was buried under snow and the new one still hadn't yet opened its eyes. It wasn't a holy day, not in the village way, but it was a tradition. And in a winter like this, tradition meant survival. Margaret had made the bread the night before, dense, uneven, baked too quickly over fire coals. But when she placed it on the table that morning, wrapped in a cloth and steaming at the edges, even Laurent smiled. Celia was the first to ask, "Is it true if I find the bean, I can make you all do anything I want?" You raised an eyebrow. "Anything within reason?" She grinned. "I want to ride the cow." Isabel laughed out loud for the first time in a month. Each family had brought what they could. A hard cheese, a handful of dried berries, a tiny crock of lard with rosemary. One of the Thatcher boys had caught a rabbit and his mother brought stew enough for 5, but they shared it with 10. The meal wasn't large, but it was shared, and somehow that made it taste like abundance. The bread was passed. Eyes watched as slices were pulled. Crumbs scattered across rough wood. Hands hovered, paused, waited, and then a cry of triumph. Miss Celia's voice rang out like a bell on a clear spring morning. She held up the hard little bean, pinched between fingers still pink from cold. Gasps, laughter, applause. Margaret bowed dramatically. "Your Majesty." Someone produced a paper crown patched from old songbook pages and pressed with wax. Celia wore it lopsided, her smile brighter than any fire. For the rest of the day, you announced, "She rules." Isabel curtsied. Laurent knelt and kissed her hand. Celia stood on the bench, all 4 feet of her radiating power, as only a child pretending can. Her first decree no chores until sunset. Her second, her brother had to hop everywhere like a rabbit. Her third story time must begin after the meal, and everyone had to listen, yes, even the grown-ups. No one objected, because for 1 hour, for 1 afternoon, the laws of the world bent. The cold softened, and laughter returned. Margaret told the tale of the boy who tricked a troll with riddles. Isabel followed with the story of the goose who laid coal instead of gold. Laurent added a tale so ridiculous it made the butcher's boy snort stew through his nose. Even the priest chuckled. Not out of politeness, but out of something forgotten. Joy. Celia decreed that the oldest man in the room must dance. Old Marek groaned, but stood. His knees cracked like frozen branches. His arms flapped like sails. But when he twirled once, twice, and collapsed into a pile of laughter, even the silent ones laughed. Even the ones who had buried parents that month. Even the ones who had slept without dinner last night. You watched it all lay smiling. But behind the smile you remembered. Your own year as Bean King. You'd been 10. You made your father wear his coat backward. Made your mother sing nonsense songs. Made the village priest hop on one leg during prayer. You'd laughed until your ribs hurt. And then January 7th came. Celia grew quieter as the sun faded. The crown slipped. Her orders slowed. By evening she curled on a blanket beside the fire, crown crooked, thumb in mouth. Laurent gently lifted her and carried her to the bed. No decree needed. The bread was gone. The laughter faded. The stew pot was scraped bare. And winter, like a patient wolf, waited just outside the door. But tonight it had been kept at bay. Not by firewood, not by salt pork, not by strength, but by the absurd miracle of pretend. You banked the fire. Isabel covered Celia. Laurent gathered the dishes. And as you stared at the empty crown on the bench, you felt something odd. Not grief, not hope, but relief. That even now, even here, the village had remembered how to play. Tomorrow would be hard again, the snow wouldn't melt, the grain stores wouldn't fill themselves, the firewood would need chopping, the sick would still cough. But one honest laugh in the middle of February was enough to carry 10 hearts through 10 more days. And that was why the bean was baked in. Not to find a king, but to remember we are not just survivors. We are still people, still children, somewhere deep beneath the wool and ash, still willing to crown someone if only for a day. Let the cold come, we'll face it, but not without one day of crowns and laughter, not without one bean to remind us that winter hasn't yet won. The hen had stopped laying. 3 weeks now, maybe more. She still pecked at the straw, still clucked softly, still looked up with glassy indifference when someone walked past, but her belly had gone soft, and her comb had dulled from red to grey. Laurent watched her for a full minute that morning and then turned to you. We should do it. You did answer. There were only a few decisions left in winter that held real weight, and this was one of them. Not because killing a hen was tragic. You'd done it before. You'd done worse. But because of what it meant, what it cost, what it risked. The hen wasn't food. Not yet. She was a calculation, a bet. If you killed her now, you'd gain a single meal, protein, warm broth, a little fat, a few days of strength. But if you waited, if she survived the cold and laid again in spring, you'd get eggs. Dozens, maybe more. You could trade them, feed the children, bind cakes together again. If she lived, if... Laurent stood beside the coop with his arms crossed. She's not coming back. You looked past him, at Celia sitting on the step. Her eyes were sunken, her lips dry. Her coughing had returned that morning. The broth was gone. The last bones had boiled down to gelatin weeks ago. Even the turnips now tasted like wet paper. She needs something real, Isabel whispered from behind you. Margaret shook her head. We have 3 fingers of salt left. She held up the pouch like it was a dying ember, loosened the strings, showed the white dust inside. I salted the last of the pork yesterday. This hen, if we cook her well, use up half. You said nothing, just stared at the hen. She blinked, scratched the earth, oblivious. Laurent's voice was harder now. We can't wait on maybes. She's not laying. She won't. It's been too cold. And if Celia gets worse, Margaret interrupted. If we use that salt now and get another freeze in March and we catch a second rabbit, how do we keep it from rotting? Silence. No one had an answer. Salt was more than seasoning. It was time. It was a way to stretch a meal past one day. Without it, meat turned. Without it, meat killed. Even fat would sour. Even soup would bloat with sickness. You needed it. Desperately. Isabel touched your arm. She needs it too. She didn't mean the hen. You looked again at Celia. She was drawing in the ash with a stick. Something round. Something that looked like a crown. The paper crown still lay folded near the hearth. She hadn't worn it since the Bean King day. Her fingers were shaking. You turned to the table, opened the pouch yourself, poured a pinch onto the rough wood. You stared at it. White, coarse, crystalline. 2 teaspoons, maybe less. It looked like nothing, but it was everything. You tried to do the math. How much salt for the meat? How long would it last? How much would she even eat? Would it be enough? Would it be wasted? Would she survive either way? Margaret stepped forward. We could stew the bones, stretch it, salt just the breast, dry the legs over the fire. Laurent. If we wait another week and she dies on her own, we get nothing. We can't afford to pretend anymore. Isabel, you're all talking like she's not in the room. Silence. You looked again at Celia. This time she was drawing stars, then the sun, then a chicken. She looked up. Will I get soup today? You nodded slowly. And in that moment, the decision was made. Laurent stepped outside without a word. The coop door creaked. The clucking stopped. Only once. Not loudly. Just a startled sound, then nothing. The hen was laid on the chopping block. Feathers loose. Eyes still open. She looked smaller now. Lighter. Like she had already left. Margaret brought the blade. You didn't watch. You went to the salt. Measured it. Poured half into your palm. It was warm. From your skin. from fear. You sprinkled it over the cleaned meat. The grains clung to the flesh like frost on a grave. The stew simmered all afternoon. Steam curled from the pot. The smell, fatty, rich, dizzying, filled the cottage with memory. Of feasts long past, of roast days, of laughter, and under that, something darker. Guilt, not because the hen was dead, but because a part of you had wanted her to be. You needed something to fight the silence. When it was done, the broth was thick and golden. Tiny drops of fat floated at the surface like coins in a wishing well. You poured a small bowl, set it in front of Celia. She stared, then looked at you. You used the salt, she said. You nodded. She didn't smile, just began to eat. The others ate quietly. There was no second bowl, not tonight. The rest was cooled, wrapped, hidden. Because this was survival now, not celebration. Later that night, you looked again at the salt pouch. It was thin, sagging. You could feel every grain with your fingers. A ration, a relic, a regret. You stared into the fire and told yourself you'd made the right choice, because you had to. But as the wind picked up again, as the frost pushed through the cracks, as Margaret added straw to the door gap and Isabel rocked Celia back to sleep, you whispered to the fire, "Let it be enough. Let her live. Let the next rabbit come. Let there be salt left for it." Because now you had none to waste. Not on mistakes, not on memory, not on hope, only on what could be preserved. And tonight you had chosen life. He didn't say much. Not when the snow came early, not when the salt ran low, not even when Aldrich died and the shed door was boarded shut. Lawrence's father was a man of tools, not of talk, and in winter that made more sense than ever. The others spent mornings boiling broth, fixing patches in the wall, arguing over ration lines. He spent his mornings working the woodpile, not hurriedly, not carelessly, just steadily. He split logs in the yard while the wind howled, chopped kindling with a rhythm so smooth it could have been a prayer. Younger men muttered about frostbite. Older women worried about the last of the gloves. He just pulled his hood tighter and kept splitting. Laurent watched from the doorway. He didn't ask questions, didn't need to, because everything he needed to know was in his father's hands. They were thick, not like stone, more like earth. Dry, cracked, ridged like bark. Fingers permanently curled from old breaks, nails stained with pitch, one thumb split clean down the centre, healed long ago but still blue in winter, and on the knuckle scars, small ones, pale as old rope, each one a story no one had ever told out loud. One morning Laurent stepped out into the yard. He didn't speak, just picked up the second axe. The old one nodded, moved aside, held out a log. The first swing was wrong, not just clumsy, wrong, angle too steep, arms too tense, blade bounced and bit the bark at a slant. The old man said nothing. He just turned the log, pointed once, and watched. The second swing hit home, a dull thock, the sound of cold wood giving way. Laurent looked up. His father had already turned back to his own stump, splitting another without comment. No praise, no correction, only the rhythm. They worked that way for an hour, then two. No conversation, no instruction, just wind, wood, steel, breath. Afterward, they sat by the chopped pile. The father unwrapped a strip of jerky from his coat, broke it in half, handed one piece to Laurent. It was like passing a sword, not because of the food, but because of what it meant. That night, Laurent's hands ached, his back throbbed. He stared at the creases in his palm, deep, dark, unfamiliar. "Does it always hurt like this?" he asked. The old man, seated by the fire, didn't look up. He just held out his own hand, and Laurent understood it stops hurting when you stop noticing. A few days later, Laurent was asked to help butcher a frozen deer someone had found, half dead and starving near the tree line. He nodded, pulled on his gloves, and followed. The priest came along. Margaret too. They expected him to hesitate. He didn't. He unsheathed the knife his father had handed him that morning. The grip was worn smooth, the edge honed like glass. There was no ceremony, no blessing, just steel and breath and frozen bone. Afterwards, someone asked where he'd learned. He said, "My father," but that wasn't quite true, because his father had never taught. He had simply done, and expected that watching was enough. It was. One evening, the old man took a knife from the mantel, his oldest one. The hilt wrapped in leather, notched from sharpening. So familiar it seemed part of his body. He handed it to Laurent without a word, just a slow, deliberate movement, like placing a key into a door that only opened once. Laurent accepted it. Didn't say thank you. Didn't need to. Both of them understood thanks were already given in the hours, in the silence, in the calluses. Later that winter, when Laurent carved new handles for the stew pot, it was with that knife. When he built a sled to pull firewood easier across the snow, it was with that knife. When he taught Celia to whittle a small duck, round and awkward and full of splinters, it was with that knife. She said it felt too big in her hands. He smiled. So did mine. When the thaw finally came and the trees bled sap, when the ice broke on the stream and the first bird returned to the roof beams, the old man sat in the yard, sun on his face, eyes closed. Laurent joined him, didn't speak, just held out the knife again. The old man didn't take it, just pushed it back toward him, and said only one word, yours. Years from now, Laurent would sit with hands like bark, shoulders thickened by silence, eyes tired from watching. He would hand the knife to someone smaller, someone whose first swing would miss, and he would say nothing. Just point. Just wait. Because what matters isn't what is said, it's what is done, and what is past. A father's hands don't leave behind advice, or poetry, or prayers. They leave behind tools and marks. Every blister is a lesson. Every scar, a sentence. Every silence, a message you hear later when you're cold, alone, and need it most. And when you split the right log on the first swing without thinking, without fear, without sound, you understand what he meant all along. Survival is taught by doing, and love can be silent, calloused, and made of wood. The ground was soft again, not warm, just soft. Soft enough to press a finger into, soft enough to plant. Laurent knelt slowly, pressed both palms into the earth. It smelled like rot and thaw, like things forgotten, like hope, maybe, but not the kind of hope that soars, the kind that trembles. Edric stood behind him, still, silent, watching. The older man had not touched a seed yet. His boots stayed on the stones, away from the wet. Laurent turned. We should start. Edric didn't answer at first. Then, finally, his voice low and even. Do you know what happened in the spring of 1315? Laurent paused. Everyone had heard of it, but no one talked about it. Not in full. Not the way the old men remembered it. The rains came in April, Edric said. Eyes not on his son but on the soil. And they didn't stop. Not in May. Not in June. The roots rotted. The barley turned black. The wheat bent sideways in the mud. Laurent swallowed. He opened his satchel and pulled out a small pouch of beans. Dried. Wrinkled. Precious. They say a quarter died, Edric continued, and those were the lucky ones. Laurent set the first bean in the soil, 2 fingers deep, thumb-width apart, then another. He wanted to plant fast, to get it done, to move forward. But the voice behind him held him still. They ate bark, Edric said softly. Shoes, bones, cats, and then each other. Laurent didn't look up. He pressed another bean into the damp earth. I know, he said. But he didn't. Not really. Not yet. Edric stepped closer. His knees cracked as he crouched beside his son. He reached into the pouch without asking, took 1 bean, rolled it in his hand. It's not planting, he said. It's gambling. Laurent glanced at him. Edric met his eyes now. You're not just burying food, you're burying risk. The wind blew soft across the thawed fields. Children ran in the distance, Celia among them, hair uncovered, laughing once every few minutes like someone testing the sound. The sun was thin, the sky a pale blue. A trick, Edric thought. That's how spring gets you. Laurent went back to planting, steady, careful. He wiped his palms on his trousers, earth stained into his fingernails. You're planting too shallow, Edric said. Laurent raised an eyebrow. It's soft soil. It'll hold. Edric didn't argue. He just reached for a stick, scratched a deeper hole, dropped in his bean. They worked in parallel, no instructions, Just sound. Crows overhead, water dripping from distant eaves, the faint clatter of a wheelbarrow in the far lane. Life. Returning. But not safe. Edric remembered his own father's hands, knotted, slow, but firm. He'd planted beans with them in 1288, the year the frost came in August. They lost half the crop, and he still remembered the look his father gave him. Not anger, not disappointment, just this quiet plea. Remember this. Don't ever forget this. He turned to Laurent. You have a daughter now, he said. That means you don't plant for today. Laurent nodded. I know. No, Edric said. You don't. Not until you dig your food out of snowbanks in April. Not until you give her your own bread and sleep hungry. Not until you count seeds like breaths. Laurent was quiet. He reached for more beans. Edric watched his hands. They were still too clean, still too quick, but they were learning. The fingers curled like they remembered how to press life into the ground. The wrists held steady, even when the wind picked up. When the row was finished, Laurent sat back on his heels, breathing shallow, palms dirty, face calm. Edric handed him a water skin. Laurent drank, passed it back. The two men sat in silence for a long time. Then Edric said, softly, in 1315 a man planted too soon. His son did the same. They starved by August. Laurent didn't flinch, just nodded. He'll wait to sow the second row until the birch buds bloom. Edric smiled faintly. Finally, the sun had started to lower. Shadows stretched across the field like fingers trying to reach them before night. The beans were in, covered, marked with a little wooden stake. Laurent stood, brushed the mud from his knees. Edric stayed down a moment longer, pressed his hand into the soil one last time, felt the damp, the promise, the threat. Then he whispered something, not a prayer. Not really, just a sentence. Grow, if you can. That night, Laurent wrote the date on the inside of a ledger. April 12th. Beans, first row, south field. Under it, he wrote soft soil, cold sun, watch the clouds. Edric looked over his shoulder, nodded. Good. Now remember it. Next year. It might not be soft, or sun, or anything. Laurent closed the book. He'll remember. Because planting, he now understood, wasn't just the beginning of something. It was the continuation of warnings, of knowledge, of choices made by people long gone and still present in the dirt. And the earth, like memory only gives if you treat it like something that can forget. The snow had melted in patches, just enough to see the top of the beehives again, those two small wooden boxes, half sunk into the rear slope of the garden, behind the old mulberry stump. They looked like tombstones. But today, one of them hummed. Laurent stopped halfway through gathering kindling when he heard it. A thread of sound, barely louder than a breath. He dropped the bundle of twigs, walked slowly toward the hives, boots sinking in thawed mud. He didn't call anyone, didn't shout, just bent close, cupped his hand, and waited. Yes, there it was again. A murmur, a tremble, the sound of bees. He hadn't expected it. The winter had been long, sharp, and bitter. The hive on the left was already presumed dead, no motion, no warmth, no scent but dust and wax. But the right one. Something inside had survived. Edric came to the doorway, squinting into the light. Laurent didn't move, just gave a slow, deliberate nod. Edric stepped out into the yard. No words, just followed. Together. They stood beside the hive. The wood was weathered. A crack ran along one seam. Moss had begun to bloom on the north face, but under the lid, under the dull grain and old nails, a colony breathed. Laurent placed a bare palm flat on the side. It was faint, but real. A pulse. Don't touch the lid, Edric said. His voice was low, as if not to disturb the hive at the moment. I wasn't going to... They stood a while in silence. Then Laurent asked the question he'd been avoiding since autumn. Should we take some? Edric didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched near the base, brushed away the dead leaves, examined the entry slit. It was clean, clear, no mould. A single bee buzzed out, startled by movement, or light, or nothing at all, and vanished into the brittle grass. Edric straightened slowly. No, they could have. A surviving hive meant honey, And honey meant sugar, calories, medicine, trade. Even just a few spoons could brighten a meal, sweeten a pottage, glaze a rare loaf. But the answer was still no. Let them keep it, Edric said. They'll need it more than we do. Laurent nodded. He understood. Because if this hive made it, maybe others had too. Maybe the orchards would bloom. Maybe the squash would pollinate. Maybe they'd have apples again in September. Maybe this wasn't just a fluke. Maybe it was spring. Isabel came out next, with Celia trailing behind her. They'd seen the two men standing in the garden, unmoving. They knew what that meant. Celia ran ahead, slipping in the mud, reaching the hive too fast. Laurent held out an arm. Careful. But the child didn't touch it. Just crouched beside it, like a priestess at a shrine. It's alive, she asked. It is. Her eyes widened. Does that mean the queen lived too? Laurent smiled. She must have. They didn't call the neighbours, didn't knock on doors. But by mid-afternoon, 3 more villagers had quietly wandered over. Word travelled without speaking. They gathered around the hive like pilgrims, not to celebrate, but to witness. No one talked loudly, no one dared. One wrong sound could scare the luck away. Even the priest, who eventually arrived, didn't offer a prayer. He just stood with his hands behind his back and closed his eyes. A woman asked, "Will we take any?" Laurent said. "Not this year." The woman nodded. She knew what that meant. A few children whispered questions. And what do bees do when it's cold? Do they sleep? Do they talk? Do they miss flowers? No one had answers. But no one stopped the asking, because wonder was rare these days, and deserved to live too. Margaret brought a bowl of melted snow, set it in the sun near the hive, just far enough not to frighten. She crumbled a pinch of dry thyme across it. "For their thirst," she said. Someone laughed softly. "You think they'll drink from that?" Margaret didn't respond. The bees would choose, but the bowl was there. And that was the point. By evening, the crowd had gone, back to firewood, to stitching, to broth and boots and sleep. The hive was still humming, low, steady, almost a song. That night, at supper, Celia asked if bees ever died of loneliness. Laurent said no, then paused, then added they die when they get too cold, or too hungry, or when no one tends them. She was quiet a moment, then whispered, "We didn't forget them." "No," he said, "we didn't." Edric sat at the table, hands still dirty from the garden. He looked over at Laurent. "You remember the frost in 15, Laurent nodded. "We had bees then too." Edric leaned back. "They didn't make it." He didn't say it out loud, but the message was clear. "This is rare. This is a gift. Don't waste it." Laurent looked at his hands, calloused, cracked, still stained with the memory of planting, still sore from the axe, still full of winter, and still ready for spring. In the weeks to come, they checked the hive gently, never opened it, just felt for the heat, listened for the sound, watched for bees. They came slowly at first, then with purpose. Small workers, golden black, tired but alive. One morning, 3 circled Celia's hair as she stood outside. She didn't swat them, just laughed. "Maybe they like me." Laurent smiled. "They like survivors." No honey was taken. Not that spring. Not that summer. When the apple blossoms came, they bloomed thick. The orchard whispered with wings. In September, they would harvest. In October, they would jar. But for now, they waited. Because if the bees lived, if the hive held, if the queen flew one more season, then maybe they would too. You can live through winter with fire and will. But to live through spring, you need bees. Not for sweetness, but for continuity. For the world to begin again. The snow didn't vanish. It retreated, bit by bit, day by day, 1 foot backward for every step forward. And in its place nothing bloomed. No flowers. No sudden green. Just a soggy mess of brown and rot and last year's failure. But then one morning a sound. Not the wind. Not the fire cracking. Not footsteps or coughing or water dripping from the eaves. A bird. Laurent stopped mid-step on his way to the woodpile. He tilted his head, listened. Yes. There it was again. A short, dry chirp. Not quite song, not quite call. Just testing the air. The kind of sound a creature makes to ask the world if it's ready. Inside the cottage. Celia sat up. "Birds," she said aloud. Isabel looked up from her sewing. Already Celia nodded. No one moved for a moment, just listened. Because birds never announce spring. They ask for it. Laurent returned with kindling, but slower now. More watchful. And when the second bird sang, clearer and higher, someone else laughed. Not loud, just once. But it felt like something broke open. The ground was still damp, still littered with pale, curling leaves from last October. But between them, here and there, a glint of green. No blossoms, no buds, just nettles and dandelions. The first bitter things. Margaret crouched near the garden's edge. Her basket was half full already, leaves that stung, stalks that would turn sour in stew, plants most people ignored or cursed. But she picked them like treasure. "These are the ones that save us," she said to Celia, who knelt beside her. "Not the soft ones, not the sweet ones. These—" Celia frowned, holding up a stinging leaf. "It hurts." Margaret nodded. "That means it works." They gathered quietly, not because it was sacred, but because it was important. Tansy, sorrel, chickweed, wild medicine, spring in the language of survival, not celebration. Laurent joined them after midday meal. He brought the Yarlestier's vinegar infusion, still sharp. Margaret dipped the nettles in it before packing them in salt. "Eat too much, and it'll twist your stomach. Eat just enough." She tapped her chest. "You feel it here first?" Celia asked. "Where did you learn this?" Margaret's eyes went soft. "My mother, her mother, and a woman who once lived near the river, with fingers missing from frostbite, who said she'd rather lose a hand than forget which leaves grow first. They didn't write it down. No one did. Because books don't live through hunger, but people do. And so the teaching went, whispered beside beds, passed during chores, named leaf by leaf over soup pots and splinters. Not wisdom, just instructions, like lighting a fire or like planting beans. The bitter plants came first for a reason, not because they tasted good, but because they cleared. The salt, the rot, the smoke in your lungs, the thickness in your joints, they made you sweat, they made you empty, and then slowly ready. Celia picked her first bunch of dandelion greens with bare hands. She winced once, then kept going. Laurent handed her a cloth. "Wrap them before you bring them in." She nodded. Her fingers were red, but her face was bright. The birds returned in twos and threes now. Not music yet, but patterns, calls, answers, warning, claim. Their wings beat low between the trees, stirring the air in little gusts that carried the scent of thaw. Dead leaves still blanketed the garden, but now they were being pushed aside. Later that night, Margaret brewed a tonic. Dandelion, nettle, vinegar, honey, just 1 spoon per person. Celia wrinkled her nose at the taste. "It's bitter." Margaret smiled. Spring is always bitter at the start. Isabel drank hers slowly, eyes closed. You could almost see it working, moving through her blood, telling the body wake up, start again, try. Laurent drank his in 1 swallow. "More tomorrow, more every day," Margaret said, "until the sweetness returns." Outside, the moon rose quiet and thin, still cold and still pale. But beneath it, under dead leaves and hard-won mud, life was whispering. And this time, the villagers heard it, not because it shouted, but because they were finally still enough to listen. They began counting what remained, not with excitement, not to prepare, just to know, to see what had outlived the cold, what had made it through. In the corner near the hearth, Margaret unwrapped the salt pouch. Less than half remained. She nodded quietly. Enough for soups. Enough for summer pickling if they were lucky. Beside her, Laurent opened the grain chest. 1 sack of barley, still dry. Half a sack of rye musty, but not spoiled. A handful of beans they'd never planted. Forgotten in a jar behind the onions. Isabel lit a candle. Not because it was dark, but because she wanted to see clearly. In the back cupboard, she counted 5 spoons, 1 cracked, 1 bent, 2 missing entirely, 3 bowls, 2 with chips, 1 perfect. That felt strange, as if something intact had no place here. Edric sorted firewood. They had 33 pieces left. He stacked them by size, as if that gave them more weight. "It'll last through April," he said. No one answered. They all knew April had its own kind of cold. Celia found a pair of shoes beneath the bed, too small now, worn, but not ruined. She sat beside the hearth, turning them over in her lap like a puzzle. Should we save them? Laurent nodded. For the next one. Who's next? He paused, then whispered, "Well, see." In a cloth bundle near the wall, they found half a wheel of cheese, hardened but edible, and 2 onions that had started to sprout, little green stems curling toward the window. Isabel smiled faintly. They still want to live. Later that afternoon, Margaret opened the medicine box. It wasn't much. A twist of dried thyme, a single clove of garlic, 3 pine cones still fragrant, and 1 strip of linen soaked in honey from last August. Celia leaned in. "Does it still work?" Margaret shrugged. "Only if you believe it does." They laid everything on the table. Not like a feast, more like a memorial. The last candle, the last soap shard, the last piece of wool not yet sewn, even the broken comb, even the dull knife, even the bone pin with the missing tip, each object a survivor, each one a witness. Laurent ran a hand over the table. These weren't supplies, they were reasons. Reasons they were still here. Reasons the fire hadn't gone out. Reasons Celia was asleep instead of underground. No one said anything, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been said in the breaking and the rationing, in the quiet choices made when no one else was looking. "Keep the sprouted onions," Edric said. "They'll seed. Sharpen the bent spoon," Margaret added. "It can become a tool. Turn the old shoes into patches." Isabel offered. "The soles are good." Laurent nodded to each suggestion. He didn't write anything down. He would remember. That's what leftovers are for, to remind you. That evening they put everything back, not hidden, not hoarded, just placed where it could be found again. Because winter might come again. And when it does, it never announces itself with snow. It starts with forgetting. Forgetting how precious a spoon is. Forgetting how long an onion can last. Forgetting who made it through and who didn't. But not this time. Not in this house. Not while these things were still warm from touch. Still marked by fingerprints. Still here. That night, after the last log was placed in the hearth and the broth scraped from the pot, Celia asked, "Where's old Madame Lynette?" The question dropped softly, like ash. No one answered right away. Edric looked at the fire. Isabel lowered her knitting. Margaret took a slow breath, then set down her spoon. "She's gone, darling," said Laurent. Celia frowned. Gone where? To the place where people go when they've finished everything they were meant to do. Celia was quiet. She stared at her cup, tracing the rim with one finger. Then she asked, "Did anyone else go?" Margaret looked at Laurent. He nodded once, and so, without plan or decision, they began. "Madame Lynette," said Margaret, "who brought time cookies at Epiphany, and old Aldrich," Edric added, "who kept firewood under his bed, and the miller's boy," Laurent said softly, "the one who played flute with 3 fingers." Celia leaned forward. "Did he die?" "Yes, but he was funny. He was..." Isabel took up the thread. There was the Thatcher sisters, Evelyn and May, both gone by the second snow. Laurent nodded. One fed the crows by hand. The other cursed at them. "They both gave us pickled carrots," Margaret said. "They did," Edric confirmed. Silence settled over the table again, but not a heavy one. Not grief, just recognition. Laurent stood and fetched a small candle half-used, saved for special nights. He lit it, placed it on the hearthstone. No prayer, no words, just the flame. Flickering for those who no longer needed fire. Celia stared at it. Her face was unreadable, but her shoulders had gone still. "Why don't we write them down?" she asked finally. "No one will remember next year." Laurent smiled sadly. "They'll be remembered. Here." He tapped her forehead. "Here," he added, touching her chest. But later that night, when the others had gone to bed, Laurent took a scrap of charcoal. He found a flat board of wood from the fire pelletu cracked to burn, and he wrote, "Lynette Aldrich Evelyn made Jonah the flute." The quiet girl with no shoes, the man with the red beard who gave us salt, all the unnamed ones who didn't reach the thaw, he left it beside the hearth. In the morning no one spoke of it, but Margaret cleaned the board with a cloth. Isabel placed a sprig of nettle next to it. Edric nodded once and placed a spoon-chipped, but still hole beneath the names. They were gone, but not absent. Later, when Celia played outside and came back with a flower no one had planted, She laid it beside the board without being told. It grew near the Thatcher fence, she whispered. Laurent looked at her. He didn't correct her, didn't tell her flowers don't grow that fast, because in some ways, she was right. When winter ends, it doesn't just leave, it leaves space, and in that space, we name the missing, not to mourn, not to cry, but to make room for spring. The last snow melted during the night. Not with ceremony, not with celebration, it simply left. By morning, the roof was dripping. The air smelled of wet earth, and no one said anything. Laurent stepped outside and looked at the garden. Brown, soft, ready. But he didn't rush toward it. He just stood with his hands in his pockets, breathing in the silence. Behind him, the door creaked open. Isabelle stood in the doorway, shawl around her shoulders. They said it's over, she murmured. Laurent nodded. They always say that. Inside, the fire still burned, but small now. A quiet, disciplined flame. Not because they didn't have wood. There was some left. Not much, but enough. But because they didn't want more. The flame was company, not heat, not protection. Just something to watch together. Margaret sat near the hearth, darning socks with slow, patient hands. Edric sat on a stool, sharpening a knife without urgency. Celia had curled up in the corner with her crown made of twigs and string half broken, still sacred. Nobody asked for music. Nobody asked for bread. Nobody asked for the next thing. They just sat. The birds had returned in full. Not the scouts from weeks ago, but the noisy ones, the cheerful ones, the reckless ones. They chirped like they hadn't died 100 times over in memory. They built nests like they didn't know what hunger meant. And maybe they didn't. That was the difference. Laurent walked to the woodpile, ran a hand along the logs they hadn't burned. A quiet pride curled in his chest. Not loud, not greedy, just enough. He stacked them again, even though they didn't need stacking. Because part of him still believed the cold might come back. Because part of him knew it would. Someday. Edric spoke. Finally. I remember one spring when I was 20. We danced. Not this year. Laurent didn't answer. He knew the story. Everyone did. But no one felt like dancing now. Celia stirred in her blanket. I dreamed the frost came back. Margaret stroked her hair. It won't... Not tonight. But it might. Margaret didn't lie. She just pulled the blanket tighter around the child and said, if it does, well, be ready. Because readiness was what they had now. Not joy, not excitement, not even peace, but readiness, and a memory of how far they'd come at dusk. They ate quietly, pottage again, but this time it had onions. Laurent had found the last few sprouting in the corner of the storage pit, and Margaret insisted they deserved to be eaten fresh. No more saving things just in case, she said. Winter's gone. But even as she said it, she kept back a pinch of salt in her apron. The children asked no questions. They'd stopped asking sometime in January. Now they just listened. To the wind, to the fire, to the soft sounds of life returning. That night, Celia couldn't sleep. She sat up, eyes wide, staring at the fire. What if it comes back, she whispered. Isabelle pulled her close. It will... Celia's eyes filled with tears. Then we'll die again. No, Isabelle whispered. Well, remember, the room was dark now, except for the flicker of flame. Laurent added one last log, not because they needed it, but because the sound helped. Celia curled against him. Her breathing slowed, and slowly, finally, she slept. It was the first full sleep she'd had since before Christmas. No coughing, no fever, no startles at midnight from dreams of ice or wolves or men without faces. Just sleep. Real sleep. Because the cold was gone. Because the roof held. Because the fire didn't go out. Because hundreds of people who had once not survived, whose names were never written down, whose bones were never found, had paid the price for her to dream. Laurent watched her chest rise and fall. Felt a lump in his throat that had nothing to do with grief. Just weight. The weight of love. Maybe. Or debt. I don't know how they did it, he said. Isabelle looked at him. Who the first ones? The ones who didn't make it. The ones who froze in the famine winters. Who buried their children and kept going. Who told the stories so we'd know where to put the beans and when to eat the nettles. Isabelle took his hand. They didn't do it for themselves. Outside, the wind had changed. It didn't bite anymore. It just moved. Inside. Edric stood quietly. He walked over to the wall, to a small wooden box carved long ago, and pulled out a linen bundle. From it, he drew a thin book worn and blank. "Time to start again," he said. And he wrote, "Spring, year 1351. Survived. Celia slept through the night. We saved 3 cords of wood. We did not forget. The fire crackled once, and then quieted." No one spoke. They didn't need to, because winter was over. But the fear that stayed, tucked beside the salt, hidden in the seams of the house, folded into the memory of soup without meat, it would return, next year or 10 years from now, but they would be ready. Celia murmured something in her sleep, a name, maybe, or a song. Margaret leaned down and brushed the hair from her face, then sang, softly. Not a lullaby exactly, not a hymn, just something warm, a sound that said, "You're warm now." That's more than they had. You are alive. Because they weren't. Sleep well, little one. The cold is gone. But don't forget the fire, don't forget the silence, don't forget the ones who didn't wake up. They sleep inside you now, so you can dream and forget and begin again. The mornings were warm enough now that the children didn't sleep in the same pile. They still curled near the hearth, but with elbows apart, dreams sprawling into corners of the house that had once been claimed by frost. It felt strange, not wrong, just unfamiliar. The kind of unfamiliar that makes you pause before stepping on a floorboard you've walked 100 times. The snow was gone, but something still hung in the rafters. Not smoke, not sorrow, just names. That morning, Margaret unrolled the bundle she'd been saving all winter, a length of linen, faded, stained in places with wax and tea, but intact, soft from age, heavy with purpose. In making something, she said simply. No one asked what. Laurent knew. Isabel knew. Even Edric, who barely looked up from whittling a new spoon, nodded. They all understood. It would be a quilt, but not for warmth. This one wasn't for sleeping. It wasn't to wrap around a child or drape across knees on a quiet night. It was for memory. Each square would hold a name. Not embroidered, not enough thread for that. Not written in ink, not enough to spare, but stitched with knots. One knot for each person who hadn't made it through the winter. Not a grave, not a marker, just presence, in fabric, in touch. Because they weren't forgotten, and forgetting was the only thing colder than death. Margaret began in the corner. The first name was Aldrich, a small, neat square of dark wool taken from the hem of his old coat. She knotted it 5 times. One for each grandchild he'd carved a toy for. Next to it Lynette, a strip of her shawl, pale blue once, now the colour of sky on a stormy day. She added a dry juniper berry, pressed flat between cloth and stitch. No one spoke as she worked. Laurent offered scraps from the old curtains cut carefully from places no one would miss. Isabel brought a few threads from the baby blanket they'd never gotten to use. Celia fetched a patch from the broken satchel that once belonged to the miller's boy. They didn't call it mourning, they just called it sewing. Every square was an act of resistance, because winter had taken so much, and if they let the names disappear too, it would win twice. Margaret's hands moved slowly, but surely. With each knot, she whispered, not prayers, descriptions, red scarf, loud laugh, fell once carrying milk and blamed the snow, tall woman, cracked voice, sang in the back of church where no one could hear, little girl, never wore shoes, gave away half her bread without asking. Laurent listened, not interrupting. Isabel wiped her hands and joined in. Soon. The whispers grew louder. Edric added names too Rowley, stubbornly, misremembering some and insisting on others. You're thinking of his brother, Margaret corrected gently. Doesn't matter, Edric said. They both died cold. Stitch them together. So she did. Side by side, brothers in death, if not always in life. By afternoon, the quilt had grown. Not large, not beautiful, but full. A tapestry of scraps and knots and breath. Celia came to sit beside Margaret, watching each movement like it was a story unfolding. "Can I try?" she asked. Margaret handed her a square. The cloth was thin, but clean. "Who will you add?" Celia thought. She looked toward the door, then to the fire, then whispered, "The woman who gave me the feather." No one knew her name, but they all remembered the feather. Bright red, tucked into Celia's hood one market day in November, just before the snow came. "Add it," Margaret said. Celia tied a knot. It was crooked, it stuck up too much. But Margaret didn't fix it. "That's the point," she said. "We're not smoothing over anything this time." That night, they hung the quilt above the hearth. It swayed slightly with the draft, caught the firelight, cast a shadow that looked like wings. They didn't bow before it, didn't cry, but they sat beneath it, together, wrapped in its silence. Celia asked. "Will we add more?" Margaret said. "Not if we can help it." But she didn't put the needle away. Not yet, because there were still stories that hadn't been sewn, and winter might come again. By the end of April, the house had stopped creaking. The wind didn't test the corners anymore. The shutters stayed closed not from fear, but from habit. The hearth fire, once sacred, now burned only at dusk, its smoke thin and patient, as if grateful to rest. Spring had returned with small promises, green shoots that dared rise through thawed soil, a robin's nest tucked in the rafters, and Celia's laughter, not constant, but recurring, like a bell someone had remembered how to ring. But it was the house that changed most, not in form, in feeling. It had survived, it had held them, and now it remembered. Each mark in the wood had meaning. The dark patch on the beam that's where the candle dripped during the night Celia's fever broke. The scorch on the hearthstone, that's from the pan left too long when Aldrich died. The shallow divot in the wall, that's where Margaret dropped the spoon. The day they heard the first bird song and forgot how to breathe. No one pointed to these things. They didn't need to, because the house wasn't just shelter anymore. It was story. One morning, Edric ran his hand along the doorframe. There, beneath the smooth wood, was a line he had scratched with a nail in December. 3 small notches. A tally of nights survived. He didn't even remember making it, but the house had. It had kept the mark safe beneath soot and finger grease and silence. Later that afternoon, Celia asked to sweep the floor, not because it was dirty, but because she wanted to. She moved carefully, gathering ash and thread and crumbs in a woven basket that once held onions. As she swept, she sang. Not a real tune, just fragments, half melodies, like wind catching on strings. Isabel watched from her stool and smiled. "She's singing again," she whispered. Laurent nodded, and for once, he didn't try to silence the sound, because the house had heard too much weeping. It deserved a song. That evening, they ate outside, not because they needed to, but because they could. The bench was repaired. Laurent had replaced one of the burned legs with a thick branch, not elegant, but honest. They carried their bowls into the sunlight, pottage still, but this time with green shoots, and salt enough to taste. They sat beneath the edge of the roof, where smoke used to curl in warning. Now, it curled like invitation. Celia placed her wooden cup on the windowsill and whispered, "Drink if you're still here." No one asked who she meant. Not the wind, not the ghosts, not the cold. Just whoever had stayed long enough to become memory. Later that night, Laurent checked the roof beams, out of habit. The soot lines were fainter now, washed by spring rain, touched by sunlight, but still visible. He traced one finger along a dark streak and thought, that was the worst night, and below it, just a few inches lower, that was the night the flame came back. He didn't write these thoughts down, but he left his fingerprint on the beam, greasy, honest, enough. Margaret had started keeping a book, not every day, not every thought, just one line, every evening. The bees were quiet today. The onion bloomed. Laurent smiled at nothing. The quilt held. The snow is only in dreams now. She never said what the book was for, but they all knew. When she died someday, not now, it would remain, and the house would remember with it. By the 1st of May, they no longer flinched when the wind blew. Celia opened the shutters in the morning. Margaret baked without counting the grains. Laurent chopped wood without fear of burning it too soon. Isabel left her spindle by the window, not hidden, but displayed. The house had become itself again, not a fortress, not a tomb, a home, still crooked, still patched with grief and ashen salt, but standing, they gathered there, still, each night, not out of need, out of something older, respect, the way one sits by a grave, or an altar, or a fire that saved your life. And as the sun dipped low, and the air cooled to a soft hush, Celia would say her new ritual, "Thank you, house," and everyone, in their own way, answered, sometimes aloud, sometimes with a nod, sometimes just by reaching for the hand next to them. The fire would dim, the kettle would empty, the candle would melt. But the silence wasn't fearful now. It was full of breath, of knowing, of the long thread that had stitched them to each other across a season that tried to unmake them. The quilt still hung above the hearth,